6 days before my 11th birthday, on the other side of the world, my father, Max Lowe, made the last split-second decisions of his life on the flanks of an immense snowy peak in the Tibetan Himalaya. A massive avalanche of ice and snow roared down towards him and his best friend and climbing partner, Conrad Anker. Alex ran one direction and Conrad the other in their attempt to escape. Conrad survived, and Alex did not. My father was one of the most renowned mountaineers of his day, known even beyond the borders of the climbing world. But to me, he was my role model, my protector, my best friend, and my hero. As I walked to school that morning, news of his death reached the outside world. With tearful eyes, my mom pulled me from class, and as we walked to the car, I knew something had changed. She told me my hero wouldn't be coming home this time, that Dad was gone, and my world closed in around me. It is this singular event that has impacted my life more than any other. And looking back on my story now, having examined it in ways I never thought to before, I've come to understand how and to what degree. Conflict and resolution is at the heart of almost every story throughout the history of storytelling. Most involve a protagonist going up against an undefined darkness, insurmountable odds, or a journey beyond reckoning. This, at its core, is the most human ideal: to identify and overcome great adversity, and then arrive at a place of enlightenment and happiness. But what if we miss a central character in ourselves in the narrative of our own life? What if the journey carries on, the monster remains unslain, and the plotline continues waiting for a realization in perspective? Conrad returned from Tibet, and through a shared grief became closer to our family. Eventually, he would go on to marry my mother, Jennifer, and adopt me and my two younger brothers, Sam and Isaac. And together we would rebuild from what had passed. To many outside speculators, this was the end of our story. A tragedy, but one with a happy conclusion. Alex's story became something of lore in the community of people who knew him. And thus, so did the story of our family. It felt like it wasn't something that belonged to me, though, and more something that was just happening around me. The story of my life up until that point wasn't my story. And so it was hard for me to see a place for myself as a central and acting character in it going forward. As a documentary filmmaker, I've come to understand that empathy and vulnerability are at the core of human narrative. When I bring my lens to bear on someone, asking them to share their deepest self with me, to discuss past trauma or insecurities, shameful wrongdoings or painful realities, I have to be in that with them. I have to give myself to that relationship and shared objective so that they might feel trust enough to let go of things that would otherwise feel impossible to. It's also through my experience as a storyteller that I've come to understand that many of our own qualms and conflicts come down to a balance between ego and empathy. Our ego or sense of self can allow us to do incredible things by letting us believe that we're capable of the impossible. In the same breath, though, it can also trap us within, obscuring our ability to see our own weaknesses and faults, or confront inner turmoil. In contrast, a deep embrace of empathy and vulnerability can allow us to see our direct impression on the world around us, and thus a more real and true sense of who we are by how we fit within. In the spring of 2016, my life again changed in an irreversible way when my mother called me early one morning. In a muffled voice, she told me that climbers had discovered 2 bodies melted from the glacier at the base of Shishapangma, the mountain where Alex had disappeared all those years ago, never to be seen again, or so I had thought. She told me it was very likely that one of those bodies was that of my dad, and the other, his friend and partner Dave, who had been killed with him that fateful day 17 years prior. My mind raced as I tried to grapple with what this meant. Emotions that had sat dormant in me since I was just a boy, and a story that I had sealed off and left behind in a former self came rushing back to the forefront of my reality. How would I grapple with these 2 clashing ideas of myself going forward? As a family, we decided to travel to Tibet to collect Alex's remains and put him to rest together. It's hard for me to remember most of that journey, to be honest. My mind grappling with the strange normalcy of our first full family trip abroad in some years, while at the same time following in the exact footsteps that Alex, Conrad, and their expedition team had taken in the early fall of 1999. I reveled in awe at the life that Alex had led, that now brought us under these strange and dark circumstances to this beautiful and wild place. While at the same time I grappled with the stress, pain, and trauma I saw reemerging in each of my family members in different ways, and in myself. I imagined seeing Alex again, my long-lost hero, once again, face to face. Before we embarked on this journey, a friend and mentor reached out with a grain of advice. He suggested that perhaps I process this experience to come using the tools I knew and owned as a storyteller and document our journey. Heeding this would lead me to my first step towards reclaiming my place in a story I had seen as not mine. And with the permission of my family, I committed to filming our trip to Tibet alongside my younger brother, Sam. As we approached Shishapangma, this mountain I had seen in my dreams as a boy, as a veiled monster that had taken my life from me and thrown me down a path unplanned, we documented our story as it unfolded before us. On that day, as the sun rose and illuminated the mass expanse of the Himalaya before us, my stepdad Conrad went ahead with the rest of our recovery team. I remained behind, unable to go any further towards Alex's last resting place. I sat at the base of the icefall, looking up at this beautiful, pristine, snowy peak, imagining Alex's last moments of life. In that moment, I turned my camera on myself. And in that, I gave myself the chance to speak my feelings, my fear, and my pain. What followed was without a doubt one of the hardest 24 hours I will ever live. Carrying Alex from that mountain and placing him on a pyre that sent him skyward and back into the peaks that brought him so much joy and life and played the last stage to his and his story, ushered mine into motion. I processed this experience as I only knew how, by living it in all its visceral intensity and pain, and then trying to move on. Trying to be strong for my family and for myself, as we're told to do in the face of such things. Looking back on the moment I'd lost my dad as a 10-year-old boy, this is how I reacted then as well. It's a knee-jerk reaction, I think, to close ourselves off and steel ourselves to pain, fear, and unknowing so that we can go back to living. Even though I knew the power and potency and vulnerability I'd found as a storyteller, my ego-driven sense of self-preservation made it almost impossible to explore those dark corners I had glimpsed within myself in Tibet. It wasn't until the following September when a friend and facilitator of a summit here in Big Sky called Hatch reached out and asked if I would be willing to share about my experience in Tibet. Did I even really begin to think about the broader implications therein? It was in fact not until I stepped up onto that stage in front of a crowd of more than 100 or so peers, friends, strangers alike, and began to speak, did I truly even begin to understand the power and taking that vulnerability I knew to be so potent in storytelling and turning it inward on myself. With microphone in hand, I told my story, unleashed my trauma, my fear, my pain, and broke into tears, unable to grapple with what I'd stumbled into. Walking off that stage, I knew something was different. The only way I can really explain it was a sense of enlightenment, this feeling of weightlessness from something I'd held on my chest since I was just a boy. In that break in radical vulnerability, I found the commitment to try and continue to explore those dark corners I had glimpsed in Tibet and then rediscovered on that stage, and make a film from what we had begun documenting in Tibet. It's now been more than 4 years, and I stand here before you tonight with a completed opus to that break in radical vulnerability in the form of a feature doc about our lives, our story, slated to release later this year. I had conversations I may never have had, uncovered memories that may have remained like that, hidden, and experienced emotional relief I possibly never would have attained under other circumstances by the journey. It was, of course, a difficult path and one with many points of darkness and self-doubt. I often found myself sitting wondering why I was dragging this darkness back out into light, why I was reopening these wounds long scarred over, not only for myself, but for my family and those I love most. And it all kept coming back to this idea that if we cannot analyze, treat, and clean our own wounds, then how can we ever begin to truly heal? For me, weaving a story from the quiet pain I had held within all those years was the path I knew to reach that end. Now, I don't think you need to go and make a feature documentary film about your most painful life experiences to find the same perspective that I did. Anyone can analyze their own life using the idea of your story and place in it. It's when you look at your own life as a story that you almost give yourself a window to look down on yourself as a character in your own narrative, and by it see more clearly your own faults, misgivings, fears, and give yourself the chance, the space, and the stage to speak your truth. It was when I placed myself as a protagonist within my own story that I was able to put more validity and weight on my own actions, thoughts, and feelings. In our modern understanding of storytelling, we see it as a means of entertainment and escape. We can see ourselves in the characters and the narratives we observe in movies, TV shows, and books. Being stronger, braver, more vulnerable, and stepping up to do the things we always wish we had the power to do. But what if instead of imagining ourselves in those characters and projecting the traits we idolize in them, the truths we couldn't speak, the actions we couldn't take until it was too late because our ego held us back, we reimagine our own stories, place ourselves as the protagonist that steps up onto that stage, faces their darkness, and draws it into light. And in that break and radical vulnerability and shift in perspective, finds that we're capable of being the hero of our own stories all along. Thank you so much.